I'd like to welcome everyone. We've had registrants from 4 different continents, so I'm extremely pleased to welcome all of you. So good morning, good evening, afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. I guess Jake really needs no introduction, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway. We have Jacob Williams / Jake Williams, who's the Executive Director of Cyber Threat Intelligence here at SIEM. My name is Brandon Ho. I head marketing here. And we are hosting our first AMA style event of the year. The tone will be light, but the questions are already very meaty, so we'll dive into that soon. We've received quite a fair number of questions already, but feel free to please post your questions in the Q&A section below. If we can get to them, we will, and Jake will help to identify questions that he think would be interesting for him to respond to. Besides that, it's pretty much no holds barred here. And I am going to begin by reading the first question on our list. What do you expect the daily or weekly responsibilities of a threat intelligence analyst to include?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And we actually picked this one to start with here because it was pre-submitted, and it is such a great question. When I talk to different threat intel analysts, if I ask 10 different threat intel analysts that question, I'm going to get 10 different answers. All right. So you should know that as I respond to this, that even if you're not doing the things that I kind of say, this is what I'd expect, that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong necessarily. It doesn't mean that I'm doing it right. It just means that, threat intel is such a broad field. And I see a question there in the chat asking, will this be reported? Yes. I'm positive it's being reported, and we'll definitely publish this back out. Yeah, definitely. But as we talk about, what are those responsibilities and what do we expect them to be? I like to focus on the intelligence lifecycle. And if you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend you take a look at that. The intelligence lifecycle starts with defining requirements. What are my stakeholder requirements? And I'll be honest, as I've consulted in building cyber threat intel teams in the past, oftentimes when I go in and talk to the CTI leadership, right, or the folks that are supposed to be running the program, or, I ask, what are your stakeholder requirements? And we find out that not only do they not know the stakeholder requirements, they're making up their own requirements. They don't often know who their stakeholders are. And so my first recommendation here is go find out who are your stakeholders, who are the customers of the CTI team. Oftentimes, the easiest way for me to do that is who ultimately budgets for the CTI team, right? So who said, we need this, right? And I go ask them, right, what do you think a CTI team should be? Because that's going to help me understand, really what my responsibilities should be. I see 3 areas of CTI: tactical, operational, and strategic. No one CTI analyst does them all. Tactical largely focuses around IOCs, detection engineering, and threat tracking, but not at a campaign level necessarily, down at more an intrusion level. And as we get into operational, that's more data sharing. I like to call these folks business bilingual. They speak the business. They also can translate that down to the tech. They do deal some in IOCs, but not day-to-day creating IOCs, YARA rules, etc. And so they're the ones that maintain most of our sharing relationships, right? So they would be the ones that I would expect to go and, let's say, work with an ISAC or an ISAL, for instance, right? So, but that's typically who I'd see there. And then the strategic level folks, they are dealing with my executive level and more long-term threat intelligence requirements. An example of one of these would be, when basically, let's say my organization is considering moving manufacturing of a widget from Taiwan to India, right? How does that change our cyber threat profile? Obviously, there are business folks handling the business side of that. Does that move change our threat profile in any way? What kind of things could we do to reduce our threat profile? Maybe we're not moving anything, but what kind of things should we be thinking about from an executive, a board level? If you're a publicly traded company, this oftentimes helps them, helps your stakeholders file the appropriate paperwork with the SEC to discuss risk, right? Something that some folks, I believe, are learning a lot about recently with the SEC, right? So, but your daily, weekly responsibilities, a lot of that's gonna come down to which of those areas do you work in? Sometimes the answer is, again, multiples, or I straddle a little of those. If you're trying to do all 3 in any sized organization, Right? That's too much work. You're probably doing all of them poorly. I like to grab something, focus on a particular area, do that well, and then bring on headcount, basically to do additional areas as the business finds them, basically cost justified. So I know it's probably going to sound like a cop out, right? That I didn't answer explicitly what I expect it to be, but hopefully it gives you an idea of like how I start structuring that. It's and if I have one piece of advice as you're starting to build out requirements, it's not a question of what would be valuable for the organization. We're all resource constrained. I've never worked in an organization that's not, and so for me, the first thing that I'm asking is what's most valuable, right, to the org, right? So with my limited headcount, whether it's 1, 2, 10, whatever, very few organizations have 10 CTI analysts, but whatever that number is, how can that set of resources provide the most value to the org? And so the number one thing that piece of advice I'll give you there is, as you're gathering those requirements, don't necessarily prioritize or look at requirements as, would this be valuable? If yes, we're doing it, right? Step back, gather all of the requirements, prioritize those, and then pick everything that's above the cut line for what you can actually resource today.
I'm just add a follow-on question to that, Jake. So you mentioned the stakeholders early on. For a nascent or less mature CTI effort, who are the typical stakeholders that you'd recommend by title or by department?
Ooh, yeah, that's a really good question. So the director of my SOC, Security Operations Center, is typically a stakeholder for tactical CTI. Same for threat hunt and incident response. So whoever runs those, sometimes that's the same individual who runs all three of those, departments or areas within your organization. As they get into operational cyber threat intelligence, that's typically includes folks in GRC, right? So governance risk compliance, because they oftentimes have compliance requirements where they need to know, are you sharing threat intelligence? Are you part of industry programs? That kind of stuff, right? And so they would be a stakeholder there. Another big stakeholder there, remember I've used the term business bilingual, right? If you heard that term and you were thinking, man, that sounds a lot like a CISO, you're right. So your CISO and CIO probably sit there in the operational level. And then at the strategic level, it's literally anybody in the organization who has a need to understand how cyber risk basically impacts the business, right? And so folks that I'd suggest there, at least talking to, would be folks like my chief risk officer, certainly my chief risk officer, legal counsel, anybody that's in compliance, not cyber security compliance, but compliance more generally with other industry regulations. Those are folks that I generally like to talk to there. And then chief ops, right? Because your chief ops has their hands in everything. So that's a great follow-on.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm moving on to the next question. If there is a dearth of EDR capabilities and SIEM or SIEM, what are the top 1 or 2 things we can do to hunt for internal threats?
Yikes. Okay, so you've got, and when we say dearth here, right? So do we mean too much or too little? My apologies here.
It's too little.
Dearth is too little. Okay, yeah. Got it, right? So we have too little. Yikes. Too little. What are the top 1 or 2 things? Sysmon. Actually, forget that. Nope, that was number 2. Number 1, it's increase the size of your event logs on every Windows system, right? So out of the box, your Windows systems have a whopping 20 megabytes of log storage for security event logs. That's insane, right? Your Ubuntu systems, by default, rotate logs off after 14 days. That's also insane, right? We have the Verizon DBIR, we have M-Trends, we have lots of different reporting. None of it indicates that you will reliably and consistently detect an intrusion inside of a couple of days, right? So I need more log data, right? So I have a lack of SIEM, and even when I have SIEM, I'm not forwarding every log from every system to, basically to the SIEM. So while I recognize that threat actors can delete logs, that itself is a TTP. That itself tells me something, as an investigator. But hunting for internal threats. Again, I'd start there because I can't hunt in data that I don't have. right? So I'd recommend increase the size of your event logs and then change your audit policy. Our threat actors need to execute code, right? So I want to make sure that I'm logging my executable or logging execution traces on Windows. That's process auditing, right? And I want to make sure I'm getting command lines of that. On Linux, I'm going to be enabling audit daemon. And then again, I want to make sure that I'm retaining that data for long enough that I can hunt across, more than a few days of that data, right? So 20 megabytes, I increase that to 500 megabytes like that. I mean, that's just like immediate, like that, 500 megabytes, right? I got the disk space, right? And then I deploy Sysmon, right? Sysmon is fantastic. I love Sysmon as a tool. Swift on Security, who by the way is a fantastic human being, has a great starter pack, and I want to note it's a starter pack of basically a Sysmon config. It's not ideal. There's stuff that gets missed, right? Ideal, you tune it in your own environment. You run purple team exercises so that you know what you're going to see. But that's going to start by getting you telemetry. Now, what are you hunting for? You're going to go through and you're going to hunt for lull bins, right? Because I'm going to presume here that you have some endpoint protection capability, whether that's just Defender or some third-party AV. You're going to go hunt for living off-land binaries. If you're not familiar with lull bins, that's where I'd start. And I'll drop in the chat here. One of my favorite ones to go after, I love to go after bits admin because it has such a great signal to noise ratio. It's almost always when I see it, it's a threat actor, right? Another thing that I like to do is I like to go and look in program data, right? So the program data, if there's anything executing from there that's not Defender, right? It's either third-party software or it's malware, right? And so these are just little hunting tips that I've started with and found here and started with. And again, ideally you're going to go purple team your stuff, but so a purple team meaning like you're going to go run adversary emulations where you know what you can and can't detect. Here that we're talking about hunting, again, I'd start there, get your execution traces and go after program data, go after bits admin. Run DL32, a lot of people recommend that. That is not a good place to start, right? That's a good play. That's almost like throwing your kid in the deep end of the pool and being like, good luck, buddy, right? You're going to, either sink or swim, and you don't want to be sinking, right? So, yeah. Anyway.
All right, from that question, we're going to zoom out to a much, much higher level and approach the next question, which is, what are the latest threats or trends that you are most worried about for the industry as a whole?
Man. Okay. I'm going to start with probably the one that concerns me the most. If I had to pick just like one trend that concerns me the most, I think it's probably boot camps, right? I know folks were talking about something else here when they asked the question, but I do want to go ahead and mention this, right?
It's fair answer. Yep.
Fair answer. Yeah. No, it's boot camps, right? So we have a lot of folks that are transitioning into cybersecurity, right? There's a cybersecurity gold rush right now. If you watch TV, you watch, pick a channel on cable, right? Basic cable. At 2 in the morning, you are going to see infomercials, right? Not full half-hour infomercials, but you're going to see the infomercial where turbocharge your career, come to boot camp, whatever, and become a cyber person. And so, I want to be super clear. I have a boot camp grad on my team, 2 of them actually, and they're fantastic. There are great people coming out of those boot camps, but one thing that I'm looking for on those is making sure that people aren't jumping into the I graduated boot camp, therefore I know what I'm doing, right? That's almost like, when you graduate driving school, I don't know what I'm doing. I know just enough to get behind the wheel and legally not murder somebody, right? I'm not an experienced driver. I'm not good at it yet, right? And so I would say that's a big one for me because I'm seeing a lot of, before joining the site, I did a lot of incident response, and I can attribute a lot of incidents to a lot of overconfidence. And I've never seen more overconfidence than I have recently with kind of that boot camp phenomenon. All that said, let me back out and answer the question the way it was intended, right? So take the cheeky answer, and we'll talk about the top 1 or 2 real threats that, or adversary threats, I guess is really what we're looking at there. I think one is cloud migration, right? So, and threat actors understanding how to target a lot of our cloud deployed assets better, right? I know some people are like, well, hold on a second, that's not really new. Well, we've definitely seen compromises in AWS. We've seen compromises elsewhere. They've been largely by commodity threat actors, right? So AWS, you may remember a few years ago, Memcache daemon, that was a big thing for a while. We've got obviously MongoDB instances exposed. These are all ankle biters, right? This is stuff I'm not worried about those. But my Apex grade threat actors are starting to wake up to the fact that they can take advantage of misconfigurations in our cloud architecture. And so we're seeing it from Russian threat actor groups. I've seen a little bit of it from some Chinese threat actor groups. I'm sure that there are others doing it that I just don't have good visibility on right now. And part of that's because a lot of organizations don't have good visibility into their cloud environments. That's one of the things that makes this such a threat. We saw this with the Russian threat actors, dare I say, almost 2 years ago with Golden SAML. That came out of FireEye talked about this in 2017, right? But everybody pretended it was new when the whole SolarWinds breach started. Alas, that kind of stuff is really going to burn us because we don't have the telemetry, and in a lot of cases don't even understand what we'd be looking for if we had it. So that's one threat. I think probably the other thing that really is keeping me up at night are dependency, right? So dependency issues. If you're following along at home, Node IPC, right? Anybody know Node IPC? This is an NPM package. So NPM's Node Package Manager. And so the idea here is you get an NPM app or a Node app, and I only get the code that the author wrote, and then it will pull down all the dependencies for me. Well, that's great until it isn't, right? Because that can test just fine, right, on the developer's machine. It could even test fine in my staging area. And then I could deploy it, and it's going to go download on an average server the way we typically deploy those packages. It would go deploy the main code, and then it would reach out to NPM and go grab all the packages. And then if there are updates, typically it would update those packages as well, and yikes. So a gentleman who writes the Node IPC package, Node IPC package, which is a very, very popular package, millions of installs worldwide. He decided that he was a little annoyed with the whole Russia invading Ukraine situation, and pushed an update to the Node IPC package that checked to see, based on geolocation data, did that IP address belong to Russia, right? Or was it sitting inside of Russian territory? And if so, the Node IPC package began deleting files on the system. And if your application there is running as root, that's a big, big, big problem, right? This is the first time that I'm aware of, at least, that we've seen wide-scale destructive activity, from a dependency. But we are certainly seeing lots of dependency compromises. There were two of them new in the news Tuesday. This is something that's going to continue to occur. And unfortunately, I don't have a good plan for how to deal with it other than lots of vigilance and lots of threat hunting, right? And I want to note here, by the way, that I'm not throwing my hands up and saying, whatever, let the bad guys win, right? Or let threat actors win. I just don't know how to economically stop them, given that my DevOps teams want to always move fast, right? Move fast, move fast, move fast. That's why we're using all this code written by other people. A typical project that I see in Node, 95% of the code, that's not an exaggeration, by the way, 95% of the code is all dependencies, right? Well, okay, that's great, but again, I can't statically link this the way I can on Linux. This is where I get into thinking about adversary emulation, because regardless of how a threat actor gets onto the system, whether it's a supply chain compromise, whether it's some sexy zero-day exploit targeting Office, right? Whether it's some simple command injection in a web server, they typically follow the same set of post-exploitation activity. And so if I know that reliably I can detect that post-exploitation activity, and I've tested and I've done detection engineering and put in the right detections for that, then as much as this keeps me up at night, I sleep a little bit better knowing that I'm limiting my blast radius, because as a threat actor gets in, right, I know that they're going to run their playbook. I've already tested their playbooks, right, variations of those playbooks. I know I'm going to detect that. So anyway, long answer to a short question, but hopefully that was insightful. So
I'm just going to tack on a short question to that, Jake. And are you in some way suggesting that the industry as a whole should start to shift its mindset more towards an assumed breach philosophy or stance?
yikes. Am I asking, should we start? I'm, you can cite me back to at least 2014 in writing on this, right? So maybe earlier, but I know definitely by 2014, I've got that in writing, like published papers, you should be adopting an assumed breach mindset. We're still not there. I do want to mention, though, that the short answer is yes, we should absolutely be doing that. But it's critical the way you communicate that. Because what I found is that a lot of times when you say assume breach, people are kind of like, whoa, whoa, you call my baby ugly? Because I think we're gonna be able to do stuff. You're calling my baby ugly, right? Like, and that's not it, right? The assume breach doesn't mean your security is bad, right? Assume breach means that we recognize we're being adults about this, and we recognize that regardless of how well we've architected our defenses, something might slip through, and starting to threat model around that. Right. So yeah, we should absolutely be doing that. And again, for me, one of the best, heck, the reason I'm at site, right, when it comes down to it, is I think adversarial emulation is valuable. Right. It's ridiculously valuable, and it's how we catch stuff really early, is doing good detection engineering. If I may for a minute, I think it's pretty widely known that my history is pretty widely known. I used to sit on the other side of the keyboard. We have for our government, the U.S. government. I guess we've got folks worldwide. I should say the U.S. government. When I think about this, and obviously I'm not talking about classified. As you can see, I'm too pretty for jail. That's not happening. I think it's critical to know, and we have good evidence of this from the Conti leaks, that threat actors are obtaining your security controls. They're testing their tools and their techniques, right? Well, honestly, all the way down to their procedures against those security controls and looking for bypasses. We have hard evidence of this in the Conti leaks, right? So even if obviously it makes sense they do this, but like direct hard evidence of this. The thing that keeps threat actors up at night, and I speak from experience here, is that custom detection that you wrote that I don't know about. Because I'm walking into an environment, I'm looking and I'm like, oh, that's that control, no big deal, right? Well, I know that control out of the box. I know what that does out of the box. There's no way I can know ahead of dipping my foot into the pool, right, and finding out it's boiling, right? Like, there's no way for me to test that, right? It's me like walking up and stepping on a landmine. You absolutely want to give threat actors a nightmare, right? And the way you do that is detection engineering. And so, yeah, we should be assuming breach, but also, doing that very, very smartly, right? In a way that is very hard for threat actors to counteract.
All right, thank you. We are going to shift the spotlight from general topics about cybersecurity more towards you, Jake. And the next question is, what is your motivation for doing what you do? And I'm going to say this, that having worked with you for several weeks now, you have a boundless amount of energy and enthusiasm for the work that you do, and you're hyper prolific about all things cybersecurity and information security. What drives you?
Wow. I like the challenge. I like the chaos. Actually, I shouldn't even say challenge. Let's call it what it is. I like the chaos, right? One of my favorite things about cybersecurity generally is that, I may have a plan of what I was going to do today. Typically that plan is done, like, destroyed within the first couple hours of the day. It's morphed into something else. I'm reacting to some new vulnerability. You remember Brandon a couple of weeks ago, right? We were jumping all over the F5 vuln, right? It's that I obviously didn't plan that. I had a plan for what I was doing that Monday and Tuesday, and it turned out that is absolutely not what we did Monday and Tuesday, right? Because the POC for that F5 dropped Sunday night. By early Monday morning, some 3 a.m. Eastern time, we had the first exploits that had been dropped, or that we were seeing at least, right, targeting those F5s, and so immediately then we're kind of spinning back around, and so I like that chaos, right, and it's something that I find that I thrive in the chaos a little bit, so I like that, but that's not motivation, right? There's lots of places to get chaos, I guess.
Atlanta traffic, yeah.
Atlanta traffic. There you go. Right there. Well, heck, man, I'm driving home tomorrow in Memorial Day traffic. Right, so that'll be fun. But yeah. So I guess other motivation. I used to be a paramedic way back in the day. And I generally like that whole idea of helping people. That's why I did incident response for so many years. And so, yeah, I guess the motivation is really. I'll also mention too, actually, I did a lot of damage. As a without getting into specifics, I do personally feel like I did a lot of damage. Working with the government, I would like to give nation state threat actors a really bad day. Right. So like every day when I wake up, whether it's red team that I'm doing, whether it's blue team, whether it's incident response, whether it's CTI, adversary emulation, whatever it is that I happen to be doing, I all the time am thinking about how is this going to go mess with a threat actor, and it gives me a smile, man. When I think about somebody like not getting to go see their kids, dance recital or whatever because like their stuff just got caught, right? I don't know, man. It's granted, I know that
we're glad that you're on this side. That's for sure.
No, that's it. That's it, right? Like, I mean, because they're on the other side of the keyboard there, right? They think they're done with an operation, right? Or getting to the end stage of an operation, and they're like, yeah, I'll be out of here by 4 p.m. And it's like, yeah, buddy, right? 11 o'clock trying to order pizza right before the last place closes. That. Yeah.
I guess loosely related to this is what sorts of resources do you recommend for someone who has a passion for or an interest in starting their own threat hunting journey?
Ooh, I mean, a lot of it depends on where you're starting from, right? So, read. We actually had a discussion about this a while back, and this may not be something that you can fix directly, right? But you should recognize right off the bat that by far the best threat hunters are folks with large working memory, meaning that you read something and you're like, oh, 6 months later you read something else, and then you're like, oh, I remember that IP address. That's over in, and not that you're memorizing an IP, right? But like that you can pull and think about this, where have I seen this fact before? Where have I seen this? Obviously threat intelligence platforms help make those correlations, right? When the data is put in the right fields and we all know our reports aren't normalized enough for that generally. It's anything you do to increase your working memory, great. If you don't have good working memory, if historically your working memory has been a little bit light, there are possibly other jobs that in cybersecurity that are much better for you. Like again, that's a great red team and good architecture. But as far as threat hunting, honestly, the best resources that I can think of are probably start with living off land binaries, and then I'd also pick up probably the Hacker Playbook. I like the Hacker Playbook series, and the reason I bring this up is you shouldn't read it from the standpoint of I'm going to go read this and I'm going to go learn how to be a hacker. Forget that. That's what the goal is, right? Pen tester, hacker, what have you. You need to read it so that you understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and the reason I don't recommend the Red Team Field Manual in place of those. So many people recommend that. The Red Team Field Manual is a lot of procedures without the thought process, and I think the Hacker Playbook does. At the 4 volumes now of the Hacker Playbook do 3 or 4, whatever. Do I think as good a job as probably good as job as any in working the kind of that mindset behind it. And the final thing I'd recommend from a resource standpoint, well, actually a couple more things. The Tribe of Hackers, I think that's a fantastic book series. Specifically, go grab the Blue Team one if you're talking about threat hunting, because a lot of Blue Team leaders actually, or a lot of Blue Team leaders contributed to that book. And they were asked a lot of these same type of, how do you get started? What do you, and so there you're getting a cross section of lots of people's opinions about this, right? So I do that as a research piece. But then, finally, I go download some free Microsoft VMs, right? Because they make those available for evaluation purposes. Go and evaluate, and go start working with detection engineering, right? Every time you see a lull bin, go figure out, and again, go to the lull bin resources, living off land binaries, go to your lull bins, and then see how to detect that on your see how to detect that on your systems, right? Without lots of sexy EDR software. You know, you can do it all with Sysmon. You can do it all with you know, with event logging plus Sysmon. So anyway.
To the attendees, by the way, I am going to get a list of all of these resources that Jake just described so that you don't have to memorize them or worry that you don't recall them. So we will send it out in an ensuing email along with a recording of this. All right, moving on to the cybersecurity industry as a whole.
Yeah.
Having seen what you've seen, what surprises you most about the cybersecurity today? And that's really as the question as it was written, but I'm curious to get your different perspectives on, you know, whether it's threat actors and or the cybersecurity industry as in terms of VC funding and startup growth and so on. Just
yeah, go wild, right?
Yeah, go wild with this. Yeah, please.
I mean, let's start with, I think the easiest one to start with probably is the I mean, I would say that everything old is new again, right? So, you know, how much changes and how much stays the same, right? You know, one example that I keep using here, or I keep going back to because it works, right? Is that, you know, that IPv6, you know, specifically, right? And Brandon, I think you meant to send that to everybody in the chat. But IPv6, if you watch IPv6 vulnerabilities, there are so many of them that mimic other IPv4 vulnerabilities, right? That, you know, we saw 20 years ago. So a very, very easy example of this is the land attack. And again, this has been patched in Windows IPv6 as well. But the land attack basically is that you spoof a packet to an IP and port from the same IP address and port. Right. And, you know, IPv4, this causes an immediate denial of service condition on the target. And, you know, now that, well, I should say now that everything's in the kernel, but now that WinSock is pretty tied to the kernel, you know, it will usually blue screen a box, right? In a vulnerable machine. You know, 20 years after that was patched in Windows 95, we patched it again in, let's see, 2005, that would have been a Vista, right? So everything old is new again. And I just saw some IPv6 bugs that directly mimic in Windows in what, December, directly mimic, you know, IPv4 bugs that again were patched in Windows a decade ago. So it's not just Windows, we see it in Linux and BSD too. It's just easy enough to, you know, to recall direct examples from, you know, direct examples from Windows. So it's everything is, you know, it seems like we keep learning the same lessons over and over and over. You know, the I think, you know, another big one that I see is, you know, I think about DNS over HTTPS, right? You know, we obviously wanted to protect DNS traffic, right? And protect it from, you know, not only snooping, obviously, but if it's encrypted, if it's an encrypted tunnel, it's very difficult to go man in the middle of that or monkey in the middle of whatever term we're using today. As we look at that, though, we immediately are like, wait. That's great from a security perspective. We just lost our visibility, right? And so we're now running into that, you know, kind of those challenges again, where it's like we keep deploying stuff. And I think about the early days of, you know, the early days of SSL, right? You know, I remember working in 2014 with a huge multi-billion-dollar a year regulated data enterprise, right? Worked in healthcare specifically, right? So multi-billion-dollar. Right. And they're like, man, you know, this DLP, this is going all downhill. The DLP vendor, they suck worse and worse and worse every year because we're getting fewer and fewer detections, right? And they didn't recognize what was happening. We like, this is actually part of the consulting gig, right? Was me going in and looking at historical detections and saying, well, yeah, you're not seeing that anymore because SSL, right? And then all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, we got to have SSL break and inspect, right? And so then we put that in, right? And so now it's TLS break and inspect, right? And so, and now fun, right? And so, because we needed that visibility. And now we've got what? We got TLS 1.3, right? What's the big deal with that? PFS, right? So perfect forward secrecy. And so even if you have TLS break and inspect, you get to watch that second key exchange and then you're blind to it, right? So now we've got vendors popping up and the vendor's like, oh, okay, hey, we know TLS break and inspect doesn't work anymore because we increased security. So again, we increased security. We really did. PFS is great for security, right? It's horrible for visibility. And so now we're moving to key escrow solutions that are now having to be integrated. And so it's very cyclic, right? And I, as far as what surprises me about it, it's that we, for some reason, keep relearning the same lessons over and over and over. I've been in this industry long enough to remember, the move, to VDIs and then off of VDIs and then to thin computing and then to, it's like every few years we're back and forth on is VDI the right thing to do or is it not? And we're like, oh, that's security challenges. And then it's like, okay, move back to thick client. And then it's, anyway. So yes, on the threat actor side, right, because that's my industry side. On my threat actor side, gosh, I think probably the biggest thing that surprises me there is how little it takes for threat actors to be successful. I think about John Strand over at Black Hills, and he's actually on our advisor board. But he, I remember him saying, basically make pen testing great again. He's like, I want to go in. He's like, I want to get destroyed, right? He's like, I want my team consistently to come back and be like, dude, we can't get in this, right? And he's like, it's just not happening, right? And so, again, we see threat actors doing the same things, right? So how little it takes to be a semi-competent threat actor, I think is something that continues to surprise me. I don't know how to fix that either, other than increasing security budgets, and not just budgets really, but there's also a big talent gap too. I think everybody is kind of seeing that already. So anyway, that's a thought there. So what other things did you want to hit on that question? I may have skipped any or not. Take your pick.
Personal curiosity of mine is how you see things evolving from one thing to another, and I guess like things like EDR to XDR and so on and so forth. Do you have any thoughts about that type of evolution?
Yeah, EDR is so I think EDR is really it was a solution to a visibility problem, right? We had detection on the wire, just like with like IDS and IPS, and we had detection on the on the endpoint antivirus, right? And so as we got better network inspection systems, we started to look and say, why can't we see that same depth of basically of telemetry on the endpoints? And EDR became kind of like the go-to, and everybody was like, forget about the network. EDR, it's the new sexiness, the new hotness, and we almost forgot about network. It was almost like, don't worry about the network because no matter what, they'll always have to target an endpoint. Well, hey, guess what? There's a lot of places I can't run an EDR sensor, right? So I've got a lot of IoT devices. I've got regulated data devices that, I say regulated data, but sometimes owned by somebody else. A big example I think about is like, if you go and get a CT scan, right? That's owned by almost certainly that scanner is owned by GE and probably not the hospital. It's maintained by GE. You don't get to drop your EDR sensor on there, right? But it does connect to my network. And so now I have a visibility problem. That's where XDR, I think, kind of came back in, right? So that meme, right, where the guy's walking down the street with his girlfriend and he's like over the shoulder looking at, that's what happened there, right? With EDR, everybody's like, ooh, EDR. And the network detection, right, was like, wait, what are you doing, man? Like, and that's where XDR is coming back around, I think. Separately, we, something you didn't ask about here, but that actually I'm thinking about now that you've asked it is how all this works in the cloud, right? Because we have EDR running predominantly in kernel space, and a lot of our workloads, those unfortunately, my friends, are sitting in K8s, right? So you have them like in Elastic Kubernetes services, or and so that's great. But you have a shared kernel there, which means you can't run the EDR agent, right? So we've got that problem. Separately, then you have the control plane. All right, so your AWS account where you can go spin up those resources or delete those resources, or that's all out of band, right? And so it's holistically, I see the evolution, and nobody's there yet, by the way, right? Industry wide, we don't have anybody there where they have a consolidated. We can do endpoint, on-prem, off-prem, wherever. We can do network detection, and again with our mobile workforce now, on-prem, off-prem, right? And then getting that good monitoring, and then I need to be able to cover cloud. I need to be able to cover container workspace or container workloads, and nobody has a solution that gives you solid, 360 visibility across that. And I'm sure there's stuff even there that I'm missing, but nobody even has those four covered altogether. So yeah.
All right. Thanks for your response.
Yeah.
We had a question from someone who's a blue teamer. He says, I have been a member and a lead of a blue team for the last 5 years. What should be my next career move or career path? I have interest in getting into forensics. What would you recommend?
Well, first off, I'd recommend you don't get into forensics, right? So my friends, there are things you cannot unsee. And if you, for whatever reason, have a desire to see all of those things, get into digital forensics, right? You will want to have eye bleach. Look, everybody has a freak flag, right? Everybody on this webcast today has done things on your computer, whether it's your work computer, your home computer, your phone, a computing device that you would prefer the rest of the world never know about, right? That you've done in the privacy of your own home, whatever. And again, I'm not here to judge. I don't even care, right? But as a forensic analyst, unfortunately, you see all of it. And so end up seeing all of it. Even on intrusion forensics, inevitably, I can't tell you how many intrusion forensics cases like end up with side HR, whatever cases, right? Just because you stumble across the evidence and you're like, yikes, right? So that's a big one, right? Serious, laying all joking aside, I know, I'm kind of light, whatever with stuff, but laying all joking aside, folks, if you're thinking about getting into forensics, I highly recommend you actually go talk to some real world digital forensic practitioners who have been doing this for a while. There's a high attrition rate in forensics where, folks do it for a year. The time period is typically in that like 18 to 24 months. If you've made it that long, you're probably okay. You're probably staying in the biz, right? But before you invest a lot of time, go talk to them. Go talk, ask, what's the worst case you ever had, right? Like, what's your worst case you've ever had, right? It's that's where I'd start there. But if you're really interested in getting into forensics, it is a good move off a blue team, particularly on the intrusion forensics, because you already know, blue team wise, all the incidents that you've worked. And so now at that point, right, you're looking at maybe transitioning off of a SOC or maybe a threat hunting team. You have an advantage over most forensic investigators who don't have that data. They don't have that background. And so you're going to see things on systems that they won't. In digital forensics, particularly, again, as we're outside of the intrusion forensics end, one of the questions that always comes up, we call it the Trojan defense, right? And so the Trojan defense is it wasn't me, it was the malware on my computer that did it, right? And so you're always being asked then to prove a negative, right? So did you see malware? Did you find malware, right? Or did you find evidence of intrusion onto the system that would indicate that? And again, as a blue team member, infinitely better position to do that than somebody who just studied the art of forensics and not the technicalities of forensics and doesn't understand that background that you bring to the table. What would, even beyond getting into forensics, right? What should your next career path be? If you've been the lead of a blue team for 5 years or a member of, lead of, whatever, I would probably start looking at a larger organization to go do that at, or depending on your appetite, I'd look at building a blue team. All right, so there are a lot of very large organizations today that do not have a formal blue team. They have lots of blue team functions. They don't have a formal blue team, and so I'd look at some larger organizations that either don't have one or have one in name only, and I'd look to go and take my experience and help them build, right? Because that's a spot where you can, you talk about force multiplication, man. That is just a play. And by the way, too, right? You've got that 5 years of experience. The folks that you're going to mentor, oh my gosh, right? And that's going to pay such huge dividends, not only the industry, right? But if it has to be selfish to you personally, right? Will pay great dividends down the road. So I'd really look at moving off to another organization where I can take all of my lessons learned, and really help another org out with those. I think is probably the best thing you can do there. So
yeah, I'm going to ask a follow-up question there. Are there any external signals that indicate to someone that an organization doesn't have a formal blue team? External signals, that is.
Yeah. So external meaning like I'm not in the org itself.
Yep. And I don't have any kind of inside view at all.
I mean, you always have a little bit of an inside view of LinkedIn. All right, so we can go on LinkedIn, we can search by the company, now sometimes this requires premium. By the way, folks, when you're job searching, you owe it to yourself to buy LinkedIn Premium. You don't have to keep it. Yeah, apologies there. That was super weird.
I think where you
my apologies
froze
here.
us when you said for anyone who's interested in a job and job hunting, that you owe it to yourselves to have a LinkedIn Premium subscription, even if you don't keep it.
Yeah, that's it, right? And so that's how you're going to be able to tell pretty quickly, right? You're going to go look at, you're going to go look at the, go look at your basically job titles. And if you don't have folks that are directors of, right, and so they may not call it a blue team effectively, right? But if you don't have like a director of cybersecurity or a director of, so people below the CISO with director titles, they probably don't have a blue team, right? And so this is a great place maybe to move and grow that role. Another thing that I do very frequently is, and I recognize that I may have an easier time doing this than some, but I connect with lots of people. And then ask them questions before I interview for a job. And ask them again, like, hey, like, do you have a blue team? And again, not so much about culture, right? But like, what's the organization look like, right? Do you have a formal team? Do you have, who reports to who? And you can usually find a lot of the who reports to who stuff out there on the internet doing some OSINT. So that's my number one recommendation is look at job titles, use LinkedIn, use the heck out of LinkedIn Premium.
You talked about OSINT. Do you have any specific OSINT resources that you recommend to everyone?
Yeah, file type PDF or file type PowerPoint, and then org chart. All right, so I'm looking for the org chart. Right. Oh, by the way, when the CISO reports to the CIO, get out, run away, right? You'll notice that auditors don't report to the chief ops officer, right? Your financial auditors don't report to the chief financial officer, right? Like there's a reason for that. And when the CISO, by the way, I should caveat, since this is being recorded, that there are some places where that works just fine. It is just like, again, there are some people that engage in all kinds of other dangerous activity and it works out just fine for them. Generally, I do not recommend that. I stay away from the CISO reports to the CIO. Yeah.
All right.
But org chart.
Yep. Some actionable advice there. This is a really interesting question. And I think that's a meaty one. So threats are hard to condense and communicate to senior management. What's an effective way to relay a threat landscape, both internal and external threats, to management?
Man, I gave this talk at Blue Team Con last year. And unfortunately, due to some union stuff, it was in Chicago, right? So say no more about union, right? But it was at a Chicago hotel and they couldn't record, like a last minute thing. And they were just, last minute thing where like, you can't record, it's got to be union people do it, whatever. And so it didn't get recorded. I probably actually need to schedule this up with you, Brandon, and get a follow-on site webinar about this, right? But because the talk's all done, I just need to give it again. The title of the talk was "Stop Talking Nerdy to Me," right? The subtitle was "Communicating the Value Proposition of Blue Team to Executives." And so, at the end of the day, you can't use jargon. You just can't use jargon. If what you're explaining, you can't go explain it to your teenager, right? And I don't mean your computer science whiz kid teenager. I mean, take your mom, your dad, whatever, right? Like people that don't live in that space. I was fortunate enough that my mom actually was a healthcare executive the last several years. I could test some stuff on her. If she got it, odds were good that, my target audience was going to get it. If she didn't, odds were pretty good she wasn't going to get it either. And so, I use that kind of as a litmus test. But that said, you got to stop using jargon. That's first and foremost, right? Number two, by the way, let me back up there and say that I run into way too many people in cybersecurity who want to teach executives about cybersecurity. Right? They don't care. They may not tell you they don't care. They may even tell you that they do care, right? Trust me, they don't care. Even the ones that say they do, they're not going to learn it to the extent that you hope they're going to learn it. and that's it, right? What I try to do is explain it to them in terms they understand, terms they already use, right? And so my number one recommendation here is learn to speak business. And immediately after that, learn to speak in analogies. I gave that talk at what was that? Hacker Halted 2 years ago, right? So use analogies and then learn to speak business, right? So as far as I don't think that one's recorded either. We should probably do that one as well. Man, we should have talked before this. And yes, anyway. So here I'm like, my marketing guy is like, yes, right? But no, seriously.
I'm salivating here.
Yeah. But seriously, like those are the big things that I start with, right? Now, that's probably less actionable than, like when you say like learn to speak business, right? How does that happen, right? Well, first and foremost, my number one recommendation is, and I tweeted this a couple of weeks ago, go grab an MBA reading list from anywhere, right? Grab one of the big schools' pre-reading lists, right? The stuff that they want you to read coming into the program, and read some of those books, right? Audible is fantastic, right? If you're a traveler, if you have a commute, if you have a whatever, I'm not being paid to say this by Amazon or anything, but Audible is fantastic. Put some of those books on your Audible subscription and listen to them. And then as you're listening to them, be thinking about how, as you hear some stuff in those business books, think about how does that apply to cybersecurity? Not the business of cybersecurity, right? Not the business at all of cybersecurity. What I'm really looking for here is how do I take a situation that was talked about in a business book and then apply or basically overlay a cybersecurity lesson onto that, right? And so then separately, right, because I can scaffold, the reality here is most of my executives have an MBA, right? Now, they won't remember every word of every book that they've ever read, but trust me, if you're starting from saying like, hey, do you remember Dan Collins' Good to Great, right? And they're like, yeah, I remember that. I'm like, oh, cool. Hey, this is a get them on the bus situation. You remember that? Google? And they're like, yeah. They may not actually remember 100% of that, but trust me, you are meeting them where they are way more doing that, right? Than you are trying to, explain, okay, so here's this thing, there's SMTP, right? It's like, Jake, why'd the phishing email come through, right? And you're like, well, okay, there's SMTP and there's this blocking thing. You are boring the tar out of them. Well, not even boring, you're confusing them, right? And so, again, it doesn't really work well. I'll note that some people get really annoyed and pedantic about analogies, and they're like, analogies really break down, Jake. They break down really bad. I'm not here for perfect analogies. I'm here for an analogy that is good enough that it communicates some base level of understanding to my executives, right, about the risk that they're dealing with, right? So the threat landscape. And so, a good example of this, right, as we talked about the, SolarWinds, for instance, right? When we talked about SolarWinds there, it's easy enough to talk about like a supply chain incident, right? With SolarWinds, I said, well, imagine for a minute that basically that one of our, this is to a manufacturing client, they actually build engines, truck engines. So imagine for a moment here that, that somebody ultimately, backdoored, one of the components, right, in one of your systems out on the shop floor, right? And I'm like, imagine that they had the ability at any time, once you put that in on the shop floor, to modify how the engines were being made without your control. And they're like, whoa, right? That's every plant supervisor knows that, right? Every plant supervisor knows that, right? So, and they're like, whoa, that's ridiculous. We get into the current package situation, right, where we're seeing these poison packages or node IPC, right? I was talking about that one earlier, package dependencies, right? And again, I recognize these analogies, these are very, very imperfect, right? Way imperfect. But another analogy that I've used there, consistently has been, or at least, there, right, has been that, I picture for a moment here, right, that, I buy a puppy, right, that somebody explains to me, and they're like, hey, Jake, don't worry, right, this puppy, right, because we're the owners of the parents, right, and they show me the parents, and the parents of these nice little 20-pound dogs, right, and what I'm really getting instead is this bull mastiff, right, that's going to grow to be 130 pounds kind of thing, right? So it changes after I bought it, right? It's like I bought one thing and then no, it got swapped out for something else, right? Kind of thing. And so again, imperfect analogy, but they get it, stuff that they've worked with, right? And again, I can scaffold off of business stuff as well. I like to target to my audience and whatever industry they work in. But if they're ready to talk tech, if I'm talking to my CIO, right? If I'm talking to my, even some of more technical executives, where they pull something out of the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg, anyway, pull something out of Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal or whatever, and they're like, Jake, are we protected against this? I can't analogize that, right? What I like to be able to turn around and say is, not give them false confidence, right? But to say, yeah, we actually have done adversary emulation against that threat actor. Here's how we did, right? We had 70% detection, right? We believe that we're going to catch it within X minutes, X hours, whatever, of getting into the environment, right? Again, assume breach, right? I have long since given up on being able to stop all phishing. In fact, if you have a plan for this, hit me up offline. My DMs are open on Twitter. I want to make billions of dollars with you together, right? Like we're gonna be billionaires together if we can stop phishing. It's not going to happen. Threat actors are going to get into the environment. There's going to be a boom. My goal is to limit that blast radius, right? And so I do that with good detection engineering. And again, from a communication standpoint, if I haven't run adversary emulation and they say, Jake, how are we going to do against this threat, right? I generally am going to be working off a hope, right? Whereas I can actually come back and say, hey, we've identified 80 procedures that these threat actors use. We did adversary emulation. We catch 65 of the 80 procedures. That, by the way, folks, that is the math. That's the diagrammy stuff. That's the quantifying, right? Because a lot of folks in executive land, trust me, and the board members think that cybersecurity is way too squishy and they want more quantification. That's how you quantify it, right? Now, that's not the same as saying you are 65, 80%, whatever secure, right? It's just saying that we caught X percent of these, but you're quantifying something, right? And again, it's very, very effective for communicating threat landscape.
Yeah. So taking a cue from what you just said, cybersecurity today is seen primarily as a cost center, but you're saying that using threat emulation, individual companies can understand their unique threat or risk profile so that they can then prioritize the security's efforts in order to combat that particular risk profile as opposed to doing it more broadly. Now, are there other things that a cybersecurity team can do to, I guess, create more strategic relevance for security within an organization?
I mean, nothing we're going to do is going to change the fact we're a cost center, right? We're not going to generate profit. At best, we're loss avoidance, right? That's at best, we're loss avoidance. So I would recommend here, usually, I guess for strategic relevance, it's a couple of things, right? One of my big things I do in CTI programs, internal CTI programs, is I try to make sure that my CISO is never blindsided by a question out of media, right? So if there's a story that breaks in the Wall Street Journal, if it has anything to do with cyber, like there's a quick blurb about, hey man, don't worry, we either have this covered or we don't, and here's what we're doing to fix it, kind of thing, right? Here's what this means to our industry, and again, this isn't a week-long project, long research project. It's a get it to him or her immediately, so they have it at the ready, right? So that gives us strategic relevance immediately, because the business at that point, when the CISO gets hit up by a business unit, by a chief ops officer, and they have the answer right now, right? Again, because we've prepped them with that. That brings cybersecurity into the discussion rather than it being like, okay, well, cyber will check on that and get back to us, kind of thing. Nope. Strike while the iron's hot, man. And that's again, that's one of the biggest things you can do to get strategic relevance, because there's immediate value add there, right? Confidence, right? You're bringing confidence to the teams there. So I think that's another big thing to do strategic relevance. I could probably do a whole nother hour just on that. So.
Unfortunately, we do not have an additional hour, and we are actually a hair past 2 p.m. I would like to thank you first, Jake, for sharing all your thoughts and your expertise with us. Thank you to all the attendees who have attended from again, 4 different continents. We will send out a recording of this exchange after it's done, and also send you a list of resources that Jake recommended sometime earlier during the conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome.